Well, thank you everybody for attending our meeting for the second day here at El Camino Community College. Since we adjourned yesterday, we've had a few things happen, and I'd like to report them. We did an evaluation of the chancellor, and I wanted to let you know that I have communicated the results of that to the chancellor. We had a lovely reception here last night, and the Board of Governors wants to thank President Fallow. I'm not sure if he's in the room, but President Fallow and the college and all the people who've made our stay here very nice. So thank you. We really do appreciate these college visits, and want you to know that we also understand it kind of stops your day and your week a little bit. We also did a tour of the Compton Education Center this morning, and I think only 2 of us or 3 of us had been on that campus before, so it was very good. We learned a lot, and I'm sure our discussions will continue about the school.
I know.
I also wanted to just add a housekeeping note that the chancellor will be leaving our meeting at 11:30 to fly to Washington for some business with the national organization. So we're now going to start on item 5.1. We are going to have a guest speaker, the post-election summary and analysis by Dan Schnur, someone I and I believe my husband are both groupies of. So it's a real honor to have you here today. He is currently the chairman of the Fair Political Practice Commission, and we look forward to your comments. Please come forward. Thank you for being here.
Well, Madam President, Governors, I want to thank you for allowing me to join you here today. But before I get started, I want to apologize for my slightly casual, well, more than slightly casual dress. As I told Ms. Garcia and a couple of others, my original plan had been to fly back from a family obligation last night, and this morning, dress in a suit and tie is to show the appropriate respect for all of you. For unavoidable circumstances, I was not able to fly back until this morning. And as I was telling Mr. Baum earlier, at 4:30 this morning in Whitefish Bay, Wisconsin, I was looking through my luggage for the most formal clothing I had. And as hard as it might be to believe, this is as good as it gets. So thank you for your indulgence. I also want to thank you for something else. As some of you may or may not know, for the last few years, I've been the director of the Jess Unruh Institute of Politics at the University of Southern California. I've taught at USC for the last 6 years, and I've taught at the University of California, Berkeley since the mid-1990s. When I took the job at the FPPC, it's the first time I've missed a semester at Cal since 1996, actually. And what I will tell you is that while I certainly don't want to say anything at all disparaging, because they certainly don't deserve it, toward the students who come right from high school to my classroom, I will tell you, at both Berkeley and USC, in every University of California and CSU campus on which I have lectured in the state, and there are many, the hardest working, the most dedicated, the most determined students in those classrooms are the young men and women who come out of the community college system of California. So on behalf of the faculty who benefit from all the work that you and the people you represent put in, let me thank you for doing such an extraordinary job of preparing them and leading them through the first stages of the challenges of higher education. It's been an honor and a privilege to have so many of them to work with in the classroom. Now, as some of you may also know, and your president glossed over this, is that even though I am in a nonpartisan position at the FPPC, I did work for many years before getting involved in academia. I did work for many years in Republican politics. And I want to urge you that I want to assure you that when I enter the classroom every day, I tell my students, I say, if you have an ideology, and I hope you do, leave it at the door, and I'll do the same. The classroom is not a bully pulpit for me to tell you what I think about things. Rather, it's for me to help you come to decide for yourself. Democrat or Republican, liberal or conservative, libertarian or vegetarian, whatever your leaning happens to be, it's for you to decide. I approach my position at the FPPC in exactly the same way. And I can tell you I'm very proud after 4 months on the job the Republican political attorneys of California are just as angry with me as the Democratic political attorneys. So I've achieved bipartisanship there also. The one difficulty, I will tell you, of serving in the chairman's role is it's forbidden me from offering opinions about the campaign season and about the political landscape. So I want to thank you all for having me. What I have found I can do, though, actually, is as long as I avoid predictions, I think I'm okay. And so thank you for having me post-election, because, of course, that makes predictions a lot easier. But I should admit to you, just between the 100 or so of us, that I'm not very good at predictions. So I'm awfully relieved not to have to go through that today. I will admit to you that I predicted Hillary Rodham Clinton was going to be the Democratic nominee for president in 2008. I will admit to you that I thought there was no way in the world that a Republican could win Ted Kennedy's United States Senate seat in Massachusetts. I didn't think the Lakers would start out undefeated. I didn't think Avatar would win the Oscar. I thought Crystal was going to win American Idol. And I'm still a little bit upset about David Hasselhoff and Dancing with the Stars, but I think I'll put that off for another time. So rather than offering predictions and rather than offering opinions on which candidates and which side of the aisle is offering better or worse ideas, what Ms. Garcia asked me to do instead was to offer an analysis, an overview of the electoral landscape. And I've spent a lot more time, particularly these last several months, instead of talking to candidates and campaign consultants, talking to voters and listening to voters. I've spoken to the California Children's Hospital Association and the Western States Petroleum Association. I've talked to CEOs in Silicon Valley and Latina interns working in the state legislature. And wherever I go in the state, wherever I go in the country, I see, I hear, I feel the frustration among the voters that you all see, that you all hear, and my guess is that many of you feel as well. And I want to talk about that frustration a little bit and what it represents, but in particular, about why that frustration here in California manifests itself in a slightly different way than the national mood that we've read and heard so much about. And should time permit and should your interest sustain, I'd be more than happy to answer any questions and offer any thoughts that I can that might be of any help at all as you work to navigate that landscape. On the national level, as you've all heard, as you've all seen, the voters are angry. The voters are furious. And I will tell you, as someone who worked in campaign politics for about 20 years, I personally have not seen a national electorate this angry probably since the 1992 campaign. And if you remember in the 1992 presidential campaign, even at a relatively late point in the fall, the voters were so angry that Ross Perot was actually running ahead of both Bill Clinton and George Bush Sr., or as we now call him, Bush Classic, in public opinion polls. And it was only until Mr. Perot, as many of you may remember, actually went insane on the campaign trail only weeks before the election that he began to fall back. Such was the anger of the national electorate that year. There's an old movie that I love. Some of you may have seen it, The Wild Ones, with Marlon Brando. And there's a great scene in that movie where somebody asks young Marlon Brando, "What are you rebelling against?" And his answer is, "What have you got?" And as I watch the voters, not just this year, but over the last 3 election cycles, as they have veered from one side to the other, the national electorate is not only frustrated, but angry. And we can talk more about that if you like, but I guess I really do want to talk more about our fellow Californians. Because what I saw in traveling the state this year is something different. A frustration among California men and women, among California voters, that was not laced with anger. Rather, it lacked that emotional edge, it lacked that emotional intensity. And what I saw in California, and this is supported by polling we did at the USC College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences LA Times poll, as well as the field and PPIC surveys, we found that California voters are not angry as much as they are discouraged, despondent. They're not as much mad as they are sad. And I've spent a lot of time talking to people, but also thinking myself, what is it in this national mood of rage and anger that makes our voters, that makes our fellow Californians so discouraged. And I've come up with a few ideas and hopefully can provide some framework for your thinking going forward to mount the challenges that all of you face. Well, for those of you whose memories go back far enough, 7 long years, you may remember we already tried anger in California. We already had a revolution. We recalled a sitting governor from office 1 year after he was reelected, and whether or not you think that was a good or a bad thing, and whether or not you were a supporter or an opponent or an appointee of the sitting governor, you'd be hard-pressed to argue that most Californians see our state's budgetary and economic challenges in a fundamentally different way than they did the last time a governor left office under much different circumstances. So we tried anger, we tried rage, and here we sit. And instead what we found, like I said, is a more discouraged electorate. One of my favorite scenes in literature is from John Steinbeck, Leader of the People, The Red Pony. And he talks, I write it down because I never get it right unless I read it verbatim. He says the following. He says, there's a line of old men along the shore hating the ocean because it stopped them. Because now there's no place else for them to go. And what I take from that quote, and I use it in the leadership class that I teach at SC, I use it to talk about what a fragile endeavor optimism can be. Now, like you, I don't know how many of you, I came to California, like you or like all of your parents or like all of your grandparents or great-grandparents, from another state in the country or from another part of the world, because you believed there was something better here. I like to tell people I moved to California for 6 months 20 years ago. And if you think about that, that is the most fundamentally optimistic act a human being can take. You're going to pick up stakes, you're going to leave behind your friends, your family, your community, and come to this place on the Pacific Ocean because you believe there's something better for you here. And not surprisingly, our state, even during previous difficult times, has always maintained that characteristic optimism. Because we've always known, we've always been not just optimistic, but confident enough in ourselves that something else was around the next corner that was going to bring us back. So every time Time or Newsweek magazine runs a cover story that says end of the golden dream, and I think we're just about due for one right now, something else comes around. And I don't want to talk about the gold rush, but even in the last century, the entertainment and the aerospace industries, the technology and the real estate booms, when we bottom out, we come back better and stronger and more optimistic. And I will tell you, and I've only been here for 20 years, and I know many of you have lived here far longer, it's the first time since I moved to California where I don't see that optimism. The question is, after the optimism, as we saw, comes anger. And what comes after anger? After anger comes sadness, comes despondence, comes the kind of discouragement I was talking about a moment ago. And I think, even though neither one of them quite articulated it in these terms for good reason, I think both Jerry Brown and Meg Whitman understood that. I think they understood that California voters no longer believed that there were magic answers to our problems. That if we just flipped a switch or voted for a certain ballot initiative, that was it, that everything was going to be all of a sudden magically fixed. And so instead, Meg Whitman and Jerry Brown didn't talk very much about solutions. Not to our state's economic or budgetary problems, not to our state's education challenges. Instead, I think recognizing the limits of credulity that a California electorate had placed on ourselves, they instead talked about their experiences and their preparation. So instead of a war over ideology, like we saw in the Senate race or in other parts of the country, what we had here was a battle of biography. And you had one candidate, you had Jerry Brown, who said, I have spent 4 decades in public service at the state and local level. I've been there, I know what works, I know what doesn't work, elect me and I will fix this. And then you had Meg Whitman on the other side of the aisle saying, well, I have several decades of experience too, but my experience is in the private sector as a jobs creator. And if you elect me, I know what it takes to grow the economy and to create jobs. And both of them essentially said, I'm not going to offer you magic solutions because you're not going to buy them. So trust me. And we made a choice, and we will. Now, the question, it seems to me, and I would ask the same question whether Meg Whitman was preparing to be governor instead of Jerry Brown. I think the question to ask before you talk about budget, before you talk about the economy, before you talk about education, is what restores that optimism? What causes that cycle to come back? When you go from optimism to anger to discouraged, what brings it back around? And I've spent a lot of time thinking about this also. And like most of the answers that I'm able to come up with to difficult problems, I get the answers out of my classroom. Because I think, at the risk of sounding cliched, they say the most truisms are true, but that's where the answer comes from. And I don't want to launch into a Whitney Houston, I believe that children are our future thing. And if I did, please turn off my microphone, because I can't hold the high notes. But rather than singing, I want to offer a little bit of statistical analysis before I wind up. In our USC College LA Times poll this past spring, we asked people, as I mentioned earlier, to gauge their own emotional thermometer, if you will. And we didn't get anger, and we didn't get excitement, and we didn't get optimism. We got sadness. We got glum. But I'll tell you what was interesting about those numbers. The least depressed, the least discouraged, the least despondent people in California are the people who have suffered most through this economic recession. Hispanic Californians, African American Californians, young Californians. The people who told pollsters that they had suffered the worst rates of unemployment, who knew the most people who were unemployed, who had suffered other types of economic difficulty, those were the people who were most optimistic about our future. Our analysts, smart people, pointed, because the numbers in our poll, not surprisingly, for President Obama are still very high here in California. They suspected that the higher levels of optimism among African Americans were at least to some degree a result of President Obama's first year plus in office. But what interested me most, even more than that, were the youngest Californians and the newest Californians. And if you go back to John Steinbeck, it's not like those old men hating the ocean are going to stand up one day in Monterey and say, you know what, I changed my mind. I'm going to go start a silicon chip factory. Most of them are going to stay angry. They're going to stay sad. They're going to keep hating the ocean. The people who bring back California every time we cycle downward after the entertainment and the aerospace and the technology booms have come have been the youngest and the newest Californians. And those are the people, you know far better than me, who occupy the classrooms of the community colleges of California. I'm happy, if you like, to spend a few minutes talking to you about what I think happens in Sacramento this year. I'm happy to spend a few minutes talking with you about the specifics of the budget fight, what it means not just for community colleges, but for education broadly. But if you take a step back from Governor Brown and the state legislature, if you take a step back from the seemingly contradictory messages in Propositions 25, 26, 22, and 21, if you take a step back from all the dust and all the storm and all the yelling and all the anger and all the sadness that we saw last week, from a slightly broader level, the answer to these problems is coming through your classrooms right now. Because people don't believe in something better. People don't invest unless they're optimists. They don't invest in others. They don't invest in themselves. And characteristically, as has been the case in California for well over a century, the most Californians facing the greatest challenges are those who hold the greatest optimism. What does that hold for a new governor, a new legislature? I'm more than happy to have that conversation if you have the time and the patience and the inclination. But at a slightly broader level, I'll conclude my proactive remarks where I started, by thanking you. Because the young men and women you send into my classrooms who work harder and more diligently, there's more dedication than their classmates, those are the people who are going to bring us out of this. And the conversation to be had today and in the days and weeks ahead is how do we make sure they can? And I have some ideas on that as well. And Madam President, Mr. Incoming President, governors, if there isn't time for that conversation today, I hope you'll feel free to call on me and to count on me in the future to help navigate an increasingly difficult and increasingly treacherous political landscape to make sure your students have the preparation they need to bring California back and to bring Californians' optimism back. Thanks very much.
Well, my bias is to let you talk for the rest of the morning, but you're
However.
right, we do have a few things on the agenda, so thank you for sharing those great remarks, and I expect people have some comments. Any comments or questions?
Or insults. I'm good with insults too.
No, Member McDougall?
Yes, very much appreciate your comments. Thank you for being with us. My question is fairly mundane, given the global view that you presented, but what effect, if any, on governmental processes and maybe moving us ahead as a state, do you see the return of a majority approval of the state budget having? If any.
It's a terrific question, and it's an extremely difficult question. So for those of you who didn't hear Mr. McDougall, I'll repeat it. He congratulated me on the brilliance of my presentation. He said it was absolutely fascinating. There was absolutely nothing left uncovered. I'm flattered and a little bit embarrassed, so I wish he hadn't done that. His question was about Prop 25. And I will say this. Historically, I have always been not an opponent, but a skeptic in the debates about majority vote versus two-thirds vote, because they generally tend to be arguments of convenience. When you hold the majority, like Republicans did in the United States Senate in the 1990s, and the fight was over judicial confirmation rather than budget passage, or when the Democrats hold the majority here in California. Either way, when you're in the majority, you think a two-thirds vote is a really, really bad idea, because you have a majority and not a supermajority. When you're in the minority, like Republicans here in California, like Democrats in the, well, soon to be in the House of Representatives, but in the Senate not too long ago, you love the two-thirds majority because you have enough votes to stop it. So I've always taken a step back on those conversations just because it seems mired in convenience. That said, I think the passage of 25 has created an extraordinary opportunity. And it's an opportunity for accountability for both parties. And a majority party, whether it's Democrats as it is now or Republicans at some point in the future, there are no more excuses. There's no more finger pointing. And you say, this is our budget. Take it, love it, or leave it. And if you don't like it, thanks to Alan Lowenthal and a lot of other smart people, soon we're going to have competitive legislative districts in the state of California so voters can legitimately express their unhappiness if they don't like the final budget product. Now that's good news for the next election or the election after that. The more important question, which is I think what you were getting at, is what does it mean this year in the passage of a budget? And I don't think anyone, including the Speaker, including the Senate Pro Tem, including the Governor, knows at this point. Jerry Brown, whether you voted for him or against him, is not just a very experienced man, but a very, very smart man. And if you noted in his comments the day after the election, he was asked about Proposition 25, and like a good politician of either party, he gave a very eloquent answer about Proposition 21. And what he pointed out appropriately is his concerns that Californians had decided that they were not willing in the middle of this recession to pay an additional $18 in order to ensure that our state parks stayed open. And that's not a governor-elect saying, I won't raise taxes. That's not a governor-elect saying, I won't look for additional revenues. It's a governor-elect recognizing what any smart leader of either party is that if you're going to ask the voters for additional revenues to help meet our obligations, you have to help them first restore their belief.
Confidence, yeah.
In their confidence in government. And so I don't know what the governor-elect's plans are. He's talked about going to the voters with an initiative or a special election in order to fund the budget. But he made it very clear in the campaign, he's made it very clear since, and I take him at his word, that he is not interested in raising taxes unless the voters think it's worthwhile, which it seems to me puts a great onus on him and the people around him to convince Californians either that they're willing to invest more in their state government or they need to prepare themselves to have less state government, and not just ethereal waste, fraud, and abuse, but the kind of essential programming that I know was at the basis of your question. And if there's a second question, I promise to give a shorter answer. But to me, I'm glad you asked it. It was, as near as I could tell, the most important question facing us in Sacramento now. And I am cautiously optimistic because I think that accountability does bring with it responsibility that can be very helpful.
Thank you.
Member Baum.
First off, thank you. Professor Schnurr, as we know him at USC as a colleague, has run the Unruh Institute and breathed new life into that operation and really created a central hub for students to become actively engaged in the political process. And so thank you for coming on your own time and at your own expense to be with us today. I really appreciate that. I have two questions. One is, getting the benefit of your observations, as you've shared with us a little bit, how would you recommend we as a higher education sector position ourselves as the landscape has changed in the legislature and in the Capitol to make sure that we don't lose the momentum we believe we've generated over the last several years for an appreciation for community colleges? And then a secondary question that you could answer later is just, in your role as chairman of the Fair Political Practices Commission, what types of reforms will you like to be remembered for that will have improved the political process in California?
Wow. Well, Member Baum, thank you for both the compliments and the questions. I promise in advance, for those of you who are looking nervous, I'm not going to spend your morning going through the agenda of the Fair Political Practice Commission. What I will say briefly is I took the job for 7 months knowing that the new governor, whether it be Whitman or Brown, would elect a replacement, and I made it clear on my first day that I would be returning to campus in January, but set out a number of goals, all aimed with making it easier rather than harder for average everyday citizens to participate in the political process. We've taken steps to further disclosure of campaign fundraising and spending. We've taken very aggressive steps to make information available to voters about campaign transgressions as they're taking place. And most importantly, we're taking any number of steps, including updating the Political Reform Act, which has not been done since its passage in 1974, to make the act simpler and more clear. And the task that I have given the group that I put together to accomplish this is I've told them I want, by the time I leave, a political reform act that is sufficiently simple and clarified so that the average citizen can run for their local school board or city council without having to hire a battalion of campaign attorneys to do it. That's the Reader's Digest version. I'll save the other time for when you guys have more time on your schedule. But just to warn you, I'll almost certainly, after the end of my term in January, ask to come back and speak to you next spring, because I suspect in order to achieve those reforms, as hopeful as I am that we can accomplish them through the legislature, I suspect that we'll need to go to the voters directly. And I think in order to empower the students who fill your classrooms the way they deserve to be empowered, I will warn you in advance I'll be coming back and asking for your help. On the more immediate question, of engaging the voters on this type of landscape, I think it's a terrific question. And I'll offer you two thoughts that I share with my students each semester. In addition to overseeing the internship program, I teach a class each semester in political communications and strategy. And I teach another class in leadership. And in the political communications class, what I tell the students as they begin to think about how to deliver a message to a media and electorate that maybe don't always pay as much attention to politics and public policy as we'd like them to, yeah, maybe. I say, here's a rule to keep in mind. It's always easier to become part of an existing story than it is to create a new one. And when there is something happening in your city, in your community, in your state that the news media is already paying attention to, rather than fighting for that attention, show the media and show the voters why your issue links to theirs. And given the understandable obsession that Californians have with the need for economic growth and job creation, the question then becomes, how possibly could you link the work being done in California's classrooms, and in particular in the classrooms of California's community colleges, to a future of economic growth and job creation, well, I'm not going to insult your intelligence by drawing those lines for you, because I think the reason every single one of you is sitting here today, either at the table or in the audience, is because you see the direct line between the preparation you give these students and their ability to go out into the world and contribute to economic growth and job creation. So, to me, showing Californians, and I say this with great regret, not only do I teach at 2 universities, but of course I went to college myself. I tell my students is 7 wonderful years. Just being a sophomore alone was 3 of the happiest years of my life. I think that's what happens when you work your way through. So I'm a fierce believer and a fierce defender and a fierce advocate in public education, in public higher education. But I do believe, and I think you would all agree with this also, even if it's not particularly pleasant, that in times of economic difficulty and economic downturn, most voters look at higher education completely unfairly as a luxury. And if you notice that voter interest in issues like environmental protection, and issues like higher education, and a whole range of other issues that voters think are critically important during economic growth periods, aren't nearly as important during a recession because they're worried about their jobs and feeding their children. The lesson I teach in my leadership class is we talk about the challenge of leaders. Leaders in politics, leaders in business, leaders in nonprofits, in sports, in military. We talk about the common principles, the common skills of leadership that make someone a good leader no matter what their platform is. And we talk about the importance of overcoming adversity and leading people through adversity. And we talk about the old cliche of seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. But what I tell them that cliche is not actually correct. At least it's not completely correct. Because when you're leading during difficult times, it's not simply about seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. Because you can see it, that's why you're a leader. The key is making sure that voters understand 2 things. Number 1, that there's a light to work toward, but number 2, you as leaders have to acknowledge the tunnel. If all you do is tell them how bad the tunnel is, you're not much of a leader because you're just going to discourage them even more. But if all you do is talk about the light at the end of it, then you're out of touch. You don't understand the difficulty they're going through. So the lesson we teach these young leaders, regardless of the path they're going to follow, is when you're facing adversity, you show them the tunnel, but you sell them the light. And so to me, Jeff, the challenge for this group here is acknowledging the difficulty not only that your students, but that the broader community is facing, but helping them understand in a very direct and tangible way how sticking with it through difficult times can lead to the kind of futures that California's known for. And the good news, going back to what I said earlier, is there is no group of individuals in California more eager to believe that than the youngest Californians and the newest Californians who occupy those classrooms.
That's a great note to end on. Thank you very much. We really appreciate your time and effort.
Thank you very much for having me. And again, thank you for everything all of you do.
Thank you very much. Thank you, thank you. And I will say thank you, Member Baum, for helping this happen. We will move on to item 6.1, California Community Colleges, State and Federal Legislative Program for 2011. Vice Chancellor Marlene Garcia, thank you.
Thank you, Madam President, Chancellor and members. I get to follow this incredible contextual setup. I mean, that was a real discussion, not a philosophical discussion about politics and where we are today and lessons to draw, and particularly the optimism that we need to draw on to get through these difficult times. So I'll try to move us into something that's a little more tangible, and that's where you have the opportunity to actually start thinking about your legislative package for next year's legislative session, and issues that we may want to focus on to, in fact, draw that kind of leadership from our system and help chart the course for the next year and beyond. So what I'm here to talk to you about today is a discussion about the state and federal legislative package, which is your package. It's a package of your sponsored bills that you sanction as these are priorities for us. You will take action on this package of bills in January. So today's the first reading discussion about some of the proposals that we've been considering in preparation for your discussion today. Now, for those of you who are new on the board and haven't been through this process, we do this every year. The process is in about August, September, we convene a task force that's a subgroup of the Consultation Council. And Consultation Council members volunteer to participate, and we go through a series of ideas, bill ideas for consideration, and we vet them and come up with a short list of ideas that we then bring to you for your consideration. This year, we met in October, and we all know that, of course, the fiscal environment is not going to change much. So what we normally focus on in terms of bringing legislation to you are statewide policy issues. Obviously, in these economic times, we're not talking about new program development. We're really talking about being as creative and innovative as we possibly can, and also using this as an opportunity to convey to the legislature how serious we are about doing what we can with the tools we have. So in many ways, this is an opportunity to pursue legislation that reinforces certain messages that we have the opportunity to take to the legislature, that you have the opportunity to discuss with legislative members when you meet with them. And at every policy committee and appropriations committee, we have the opportunity to talk about how this bill, within the context of all the things we're dealing with in the community colleges, is helpful. And so that was kind of where we started in terms of context. What we also did this year at our legislative task force meeting, we invited senior legislative staff to come talk to us about what it is the legislature is thinking about in terms of plans for next year, given the current fiscal and political landscape, and what their perceptions are of the community colleges, what we should be doing, what we do well, and what we don't do as well. And we had a very candid conversation and got some very good feedback. And you're not surprised, but I'll just run through a handful of the themes that they hit on to help us as we then discuss some of the specific proposals. One of the things that they said is, community colleges, you have many admirers in the legislature. You represent the largest public institution, not just in California, but in the country. And you're connected to jobs. You know, we all talk about student success, but student success, all roads lead to Rome. Once you succeed as a student, the next thing you do is you go out and get a job. So that connection is really important. The other thing they mentioned was intersegmental advocacy works, that was probably one of the most effective things we did in terms of symbolically letting the legislature and the Sacramento policy community know that we're in this together, we're about making California better. And that was highly effective. Unified advocacy, we've known that with the community colleges for the last several years during these difficult economic times. The unified voice from the community colleges is obviously effective. And then, not surprisingly, but I think this is going to be the challenge for us, is the legislature likes us to come up with some big, innovative ideas, but of course, ideas that don't cost new money. So their recommendation to us, and understanding that that's a pretty tall order to follow, their recommendation to us is be creative. Think about innovations, especially using technology that stretch the dollars and help you serve more students. So if you come up with ideas, if your bills hit on those themes, talk about that at every policy committee or every fiscal committee. Let's see, the other note that our suggestion they made is to keep working hard on the SB 1143 task force. They said that it's going to be important that the community at large understand how serious we are about this work and how we are going to look at meaningful ideas, proposals, best practices, and to continue to loop back to the legislature. And from the staff perspective, they said that they believe that we should have the time we need in this next legislative session to really come up with the strategies that we think will help move us in the right direction, and that they can't guarantee that they're going to stop legislation that's perhaps counterproductive, but that they certainly will say, give them a chance, let the task force work. So that gives us a little time to really come up with ideas that work. So it was with that backdrop then, we went into some discussions about messaging. Vice Chancellor Terry Carball worked with us and talked about a lot of the themes that we think resonate with the legislature. So the ideas that are put forward, that's the handout you received yesterday. And I'm sorry we didn't get this to you sooner, but we had to go through the vetting process through Consultation Council and the group. And we came up with 4 ideas for legislative proposals. Normally, when you sponsor a bill, you want to keep your number down to 2 or 3 at maximum, because you don't want too many bills. And so we put 4 out here for consideration, a couple of which make a lot of sense and they're not new ideas, but again, it's about thinking about what we can do as the leadership of the California community colleges in putting forward legislative ideas that help move us in the right direction, knowing that we've got a lot of other important work taking place outside of the legislative context. So the first issue is Common Course numbering. And it looks like this is a little bit out of...
It says common assessment.
Okay, there it is. I'm going to start with Common Course numbering. As you know, you sponsored this year's bill, AB 2682, by Assembly Member Marty Block. The bill, unfortunately, was vetoed, but it did get through both houses of the legislature.
I think you're talking about common assessment.
It says common assessment.
Common assessment, I am.
That's
Thank you
all right.
very much.
Common assessment.
I should know that word. I probably used that phrase more than any other phrase this past year, common assessment.
You got me very excited when you said Common Course numbering.
Yeah.
That's next year. So this is common assessment, pardon me.
Yeah.
So the bill was introduced this year. It didn't get 1 no vote in the legislature, but there are some remaining issues and concerns that Department of Finance has that we think we can work through. The legislative session ended up being extremely complicated with a combination of budget deliberations going on that we simply seem to have run out of time. So the bill was vetoed. The idea, the concept, this bill started out early in the session as just an idea. This picked up a lot of steam and support and probably became one of the more popular ideas that legislators and community college constituents felt strongly about. So Assemblymember Marty Block would like to reintroduce the bill and address some of the remaining issues with finance and look at how we can make this just a part of everyday business at the community colleges. Of course, this is a cost efficiency bill. It saves resources. We're talking about offering it to the colleges free of charge and allowing them to make this available. They should be able to provide assessments to all their community college students, where right now we're not providing assessments for all students who are in need of an assessment because of cost limitations. So this is a win-win all the way around. Again, the issues with finance are to ensure that we're not reinventing the wheel when we create this common assessment, and to in fact develop this building on existing infrastructure, but tailoring it to the needs of our community college students. So they want us to work with CSU on the early assessment program, and they also want us to work with K-12 on some of their existing assessments. And then there's some national work taking place to develop a national common standard, and they want us to work with that movement to ensure that whatever assessment we ultimately use, that it in fact aligns with whatever the prevailing assessment system is in California. So that's one bill proposal that we'd like to put on the table, and when we come up back in January, you'll be asked to vote on whether that makes sense for your package. I'm happy to answer any questions about that measure or that proposal. The second idea or proposal is called e-transcripts. And this is an idea that we actually, about 40% of our community colleges already offer students transcripts online. The difference between e-transcripts is students can get their transcripts sent within 24 hours, or right now, if you're doing it administratively, which many colleges are, including UC is almost entirely relying on administrative transcripts. CSU uses e-transcripts probably more than any other segment, and then about 40% of our campuses use e-transcripts. And the difference is about a 2-week lag time. If you get your transcripts manually, it can take 1 to 2 weeks. So this is obviously an efficiency. It's not rocket science, but the technology is becoming more readily available. And as Vice Chancellor Patrick Perry says, this technology is critical in terms of a backbone of building additional student services that can be delivered through technology. So this is an important first step in terms of providing that foundation. This bill, there has been, when we went to Consultation Council, there were comments about, well, we don't need a bill to do this. But sometimes when you put it in a bill, it elevates the issue and everyone understands how critical it is. And what we can also say is we're hopeful that if we put this in statute, or at least in a bill, it would help us leverage external resources, potentially from the federal government that is also quite interested in this area of development. So it helps our chances of securing outside funding. It certainly puts on the table that this is something that we believe makes more sense. It's student-centered, and it saves resources. So that's a pretty important message that we think we can use to get this kind of idea moving through the legislative process.
You
So-
have a carrier?
Pardon me?
You have a legislator to carry in that way?
No, not on this measure, or this proposal. The third proposal is our, an idea that, again, is not new. It's been around. It's a continuing appropriation proposal. And of course, when you have the very frequent budget delays, this has been a critical issue for the California community colleges. K-12 schools get their appropriations even when there is a budget delay. And of course, we don't. Now, this is, there are a lot of agencies and entities that want a continuing appropriation, but we felt that it's probably unlikely, but it was an opportunity to talk about just how detrimental the delays have been in serving the number of students who desperately need to further their education. Now, with the passage of Prop 25, that changes the landscape some. So there, may not be the kinds of delays that we've seen in the past, but it doesn't mean that the budget is going to be resolved much easier, because we're still left with the same challenges that we have even when you needed a 2/3 vote. So this is a bill that its chances of success are, it would be a steep political road to hoe, but it's one that gives us an opportunity to talk about what the detrimental impacts are on us for every month that the budget's delayed, and how that translates into serving real students and affecting that optimism that is so important that we heard earlier. So this, I don't have a recommendation on this one. I wanted to put this out there for you to think about, and I'm still talking to folks about whether or not it makes sense, whether it is valuable for us to put this proposal out there. But it's one to think about. The second one is somewhat in this category as well. It's a very costly proposal, but it's one that is a reality, and that is a property tax backfill issue. It's been introduced before. There seems to be empathy for the challenges we face, particularly in these difficult budget times. The property tax shortfall comes in the middle of the academic year, and it's tantamount to another mid-year cut. So it's hugely detrimental. Again, it's not a new idea, and I bring that to you for consideration for us to talk about. Do we think that this is something that it's certainly, we're on the right side of the issue, it's just a costly issue. And is it worth us putting this on the table and using it as a mechanism to demonstrate just how many obstacles we're having to overcome while in the process of trying to serve historic numbers of students who want training so they can get those jobs? So those are the 4 proposals we have before you, and I'm very interested in getting your thoughts and some guidance on how we might want to move forward.
Okay.
Chancellor Scott wanted to make a comment.
Well, first, Vice Chancellor Garcia, thank you very much. That was very clear explanation, and certainly it places before us the kind of legislative challenges we have. Let me make just 1 or 2 quick comments, since it's already been pointed out that I'm going to have to leave at 11:30, and I want you to know that it's not a lack of interest, but I've got to catch a plane that's going to Washington, D.C., and so that's why I'm leaving. We really, the common assessment is a great idea. Certainly e-transcript is a great idea. Let me point out something about the property tax backfill that I want you to understand. This simply means that if the past budget ends up based upon a certain estimate of the property tax that'll be collected. Now, I'll just throw, I don't know what the amount is, but let's say it's $2 billion. And we collect only $1.9 billion, the community colleges catch it in the neck. That is, they come up, $100 million short. K through 12 doesn't. If they underestimate their property tax, then they in turn get that money made up. We don't. So that's what it's all about. Incidentally, if they underestimate our property tax, we don't get the overage. We just get what's in the budget. The one, if it's $2 billion and it's $2.1 billion, we don't get the $0.1 billion over. The state benefits from that. So we're on the losing end of this. That's why this is a very valuable, albeit perhaps expensive, but that's one of the reasons we argue with the Department of Finance about their estimate. Because once in a while, when they underestimate, and remember, they're trying to bring in a balanced budget, so sometimes they have some incentive to underestimate. So all I'm saying is that, I mean to list what our overestimate, they have an incentive so that they can show that the budget balances because they've estimated a certain amount of property tax revenue. Now this year, if I understand it correctly, they did move the estimate down from last year because property values have fallen. So I just want to give that as, and that probably will be easier to pass than continuous appropriation. But, and I also want to make a little something clear, if I understand it, maybe Senator Lowenthal, who's in the audience, can correct me if I'm wrong. What it calls for, it says that the legislature must get a budget out on time by June 15th, or they begin to lose their salary and their per diem. However, it doesn't say that the budget has to be signed by that day. So if the legislature gets the budget out on time and the governor then vetoes the budget, then you're back to discussion. And so in all probability, we're not going to have a budget last as long as it did this year, which unfortunately set a record. But it doesn't automatically say that by July 1st, we will have a signed budget. Now, with, I'll be like the analyst this morning, Dan Schneer, it's always dangerous to predict, but I will predict that we're going to get a budget out more quickly as a result of the passage of this proposition. It so happens that there's a Democratic majority in both houses, and there's a Democratic governor. And governors tend to be more conservative than legislators because they're the ones who have to finally balance it. So he may end up vetoing it, but probably it won't take them 4 or 5 months to argue that out. Now, there's also the fact that now fees have to be passed by a 2/3 vote. That's where the public, they gave with one hand and took away with the other. Will make some things a little more difficult as far as revenues are concerned. So that's something we have to wrestle with. But I'm just pointing out that I do think we're going to get a budget out. So that might make the idea of continuous appropriation a little more difficult to pass. But thank you, Vice Chancellor Garcia, for your words. And I just would add those 2 or 3 little notes before you begin your discussion on this legislative package. It's a solid legislative package. If we could get a common assessment through, that would be a major step forward. A lot of people don't understand why we have 112 colleges and 112 separate assessment instruments. And that means that if you transfer from one community college to another, you have to take a separate assessment again. And so we've got to move on this. It makes sense, and I predict it a little bit like the transfer bill. When you get it out in front of the public and begin to talk about it, suddenly the public thinks, wait a minute, why don't we have common assessment? You know, it sort of makes sense, and we'll have some discussion on it, but I'm just telling you what I think, why there's momentum behind this idea.
Thank you for your comments. Vice President Himmelstein.
Yes, I'd also like to add my thanks, Marlene. Great work as always, and very much appreciate you working with the Consultation Council to come up with this. Having said that, I would also encourage our board members, you know, going forward, and perhaps we can spend some time in January to bring forth some ideas that we have as board members may have. I mean, I heartily endorse what the chancellor says and the need for common assessment, as well as the other things. But I hope we would take some time as well and bring forth some additional ideas that we may have. Number two, Chancellor, one of our goals last year was to try to provide the Chancellor's office a little bit more autonomy vis-a-vis our hiring practices. And I don't know if you want to revisit that again this next year, but perhaps maybe at our next meeting you could bring back some thoughts on that. I thought that was a very important piece of legislation that could do a lot of good for the Chancellor's office, and certainly would defer to you on whether that is something that's viable going forward to reintroduce.
Any other thoughts or comments? Member McDonald, is your hand up?
But that's because I was talking to Marlene while you were talking, so I was being rude. So I'm sorry.
Okay. Member Ramos?
Thank you, Marlene. Another great report, an exciting agenda, and a worthy one. I wonder, though, in light of what's going to be coming up for us in relation to the work that Member Baca and Member McDonald are leading on Veterans Affairs, given the federal set-aside monies that we were able to get in this last congressional cycle, how much at risk are we of needing to do something more proactive on that front to maintain that kind of continuing opportunity to model programs for those important populations returning from the Afghan and Iraq theaters? Is there a reason why that's not on this agenda as something that we would want to prioritize? I don't know if it falls under, you know, some aspects of the work that you've covered on the federal level, but just given our prioritization of that work, where does that fall in this itinerary of priorities?
For the state level, and I need to shift also and address the federal, for the state level, we already have legislation that encourages community colleges to set up centers for veterans. So there's already the statutory framework there. And this, of course, is contingent on funding. So what the federal piece does is, if we get the earmark, that's going to fit right into what the state has already said is a priority. So we already have existing statute that recognizes this as a priority. We may want to look at whether or not there's more specific detail we can associate with these centers. But at this point, our colleges are obviously doing a great job trying to get the funding so that they can do what they need to do at their local areas, but we already have state law that provides that framework. Let me shift to the federal. One of the ideas that we've come up with, and at the federal level it's very different because we're not sponsoring legislation per se. When we sponsor legislation at the state level, that means we are working hand in hand with the staff. We're providing a lot of the legwork, backup materials, and so forth. At the federal level, it's not quite the same situation, but we still have areas of focus. And what you have in your packet is an outline for financial aid. Last year, veterans was the priority, and we started off saying, let's look and find any new opportunities that we can search out that help our veterans in California. This next coming year, what we want to focus on at the federal level is financial aid. And the idea is to try to get funding at the federal level, and it's less likely it'll be earmark funding. We're hopeful it'll be grant funding that will help us create additional support to colleges to try new and innovative ways to increase our financial aid participation. Just like the veterans issue last year, there's a nexus between state and federal policy and fiscal policy. Same thing with financial aid. There's a clear nexus between financial aid and what we're doing at the state level. So what Assistant Vice Chancellor Valerie Purnell is doing is she's talking to folks and trying to figure out, they're saying affordability is a #1 issue for our students, then what can we do in partnership with the federal government to help us increase the participation rate in state and federal financial aid? And you probably recall the figure that in California, close to 500 million, there's about $500 million left on the table of financial aid resources that students aren't taking advantage of within the community colleges. And so initially there was a lot of thought that if you just required BOG fee waiver students to also complete a FAFSA, that you would increase that participation automatically. What we've learned since those early discussions is that 80% of our students who get the BOG fee waiver actually complete a FAFSA form. So they are applying. What the problem is and the challenge is that there are so many students who aren't applying for state or federal financial aid and aren't completing any forms. So our challenge is how we reach students who are part-time, 79% of our students are part-time, and how we reach them and get them into the process and help them figure out how to navigate the financial aid process so they can take advantage of the resources that presumably they would be eligible for. So the idea that we have is to set up a pilot project that would provide some additional resources to colleges that are struggling right now to keep up with demand for financial aid as it is because their resources have been cut, and to give them additional funds to explore ways in which to reach those students who aren't the ones who are standing in line at the financial aid office to get the information. This is obviously going to take a lot more aggressive strategies to reach these students who may be taking a class at night after a long day of work or 2 classes at night, but it's figuring out ways to reach those students who deserve and apparently are eligible for financial aid dollars. So that's the focus of next year. Of course, veterans fit right within that. GI benefits is a big part of ensuring that they're tapping those resources that are designed for them to use and succeed. And so that would be the focus of federal efforts next year. We're not going to stop focusing on veterans, but we're also going to take a look at this piece of the challenge and trying to get more financial aid dollars to our students.
Thank you. Did I see any other hands? Member Reed?
I have 2 questions. Going back,
In the microphone, please, just for the people listening.
yesterday our board engaged itself in a conversation regarding the 75-25 rule on employment, full-time faculty, and there were a number of valid issues brought to the table. Do we ever go back as part of our legislative agenda and review existing legislation that may or could be modified to enhance the program so that it would help these colleges that we're trying to serve? Or generally speaking, is that not our role? I don't know.
That is part of the process. But when we look at every one of these policy proposals or fiscal proposals, whether it's amending existing law or creating new bodies of law, we look at it within the political economic context. And I think to try and go back and open up, revise existing statute governing the bond probably would create lots of challenges within the system. And right now our priority is being unified and focused on budget advocacy, and that we should probably stay focused there because it's so critical in being able to ensure that we mitigate any potential fiscal impacts that we could otherwise experience. So we look at every single one of these proposals with what does it mean for the politics of our system, what does it mean the politics in the legislature, the fiscal environment. So we try to take into account when it's a good year to pursue some new ideas.
And the second part of my question, and I'm not quite sure how to phrase it, but it seems to me that the community colleges somewhat are in a position of being a stepchild as a third tier of higher education, and that we, by choice or by legislation, have been tied to the K-12, whether it be on Prop 98 or on the backfill issue that Chancellor Scott spoke to. We heard from Jose Milan yesterday regarding the Carl Perkins monies that are tied to K-12. And is there anything that we can do from a legislative platform to begin moving the community college system itself with the leadership of the Chancellor's office into an entity that stands more on its own as opposed to an extension of a K-14 program as so many people in California see it? Do we ever get into that role, or is that something we completely stay away from?
Well, there are two ways to look at that. One is changing the governance, and then you're talking about Prop 98, and that's a very large challenge, and it's got a lot of political, implications. But in terms of changing perception, that's actually something that I think as a system we have been working on, trying to establish ourselves as the workhorse of higher education, and that we're the ones who can turn students' lives around most quickly and efficiently. And those themes, I think, reinforce that we are a critical part of California's economy, and that we are acting like a higher education entity. I think that's that will change over time, but I do think that there have been some changes in that way. Whether it's enough, that's a different issue. But if we were looking for structural changes, that's a much larger political issue that we'd have to think about thoroughly.
Chancellor Scott has a comment.
Just to review the whole issue of Prop 98, I believe it was passed in 1988, and at that time, actually the community colleges were added into Prop 98 into the calculation, partially because they knew that the public viewed community colleges favorably and would enhance the possibility of Prop 98 passing. If you'll remember, Prop 98 passed by the narrowest of margins. It was about 51% or less. Now, in the community college circles, there's always been some debate whether that was wise or unwise. The way it was wise is that it's protected us, because Prop 98 requires that 40% of the state budget be spent on K through 14. And so in tough times, once in a while, that's been a little bit of a shield. However, there's always contention over how you're going to split Prop 98. The first year I was in the legislature, I carried a bill that said that we would be guaranteed 11%. It got all the way to the governor's office and was vetoed because governors lack discretion. I mean, that's just the way it breaks out. They don't like their hands tied. I suppose if I were governor, I'd feel the same way, but I'm just giving you a little history there. Now we get a little bit more than 11% sometime, because our enrollment is growing and K through 12 enrollment is actually decreasing. Right. It's always a contentious matter though, as to when you get ready to make that split, because very naturally K through 12 can make a very good case that they've come upon hard times as well. So we are trying, as I think Vice Chancellor Garcia said well, to position ourselves such as on occasions when the three of us, Chancellor Reed, President Udolph, and myself appear together. We appeared together on 3 or 4 different occasions this year in our advocacy in front of the governor, in appearances before. We spoke together at the Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce. We spoke together at the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco and made some other appearances. So we are trying to help in terms of the perception there. Prop 92, I believe that was the number, was the community college attempt to be a more independent institution. For a variety of reasons, that proposition failed. There was some split within CTA about it, and CTA came out in formal opposition to it. And, you know, I won't go into all of that other than the fact that it did fail, and it was actually was to give us some, you know, independence. So, you know, we obviously will have some hesitancy to reinitiate an initiative that cost us a lot of money and didn't succeed. Maybe we got some points made in the public eye, which is always good, but I just putting a little historical background to Member Reed's comments, because that is something we have thought about. And one of the things that everybody who's ever been in politics remembers, there's a little phrase called politics is the art of the possible. And it just simply means that we're willing to stretch, but once in a while we look at some pieces of legislation and we don't think they're bad pieces of legislation, we think they're just not possible. And so we try to make a call there. But I think the issue, we could revisit the issue that Member Himmelstein spoke about, of giving the chancellor the prerogative to select one's own vice chancellors, and we'll look at that again. Maybe we could change the bill in some ways. I won't bore you with all the details of what happened last year, but we could look at that, and we can look at some other things too. And I'll guarantee you, by the way, we'll have some legislative leadership, but there'll be at least 10 bills or more that Vice Chancellor Garcia and all of us will have to deal with that have to do with community colleges, some of which we won't view very favorably, and we'll be in the business of trying to defeat them, and some of which we'll think, hey, that's a great idea, let's get behind it. So stay tuned.
Thank you. I'm going to move us along a little bit because the hour's growing late. We have one member of the public who would like to address us on this.
Yes, Alex Pater, President of the Student Senate. Did I say that right, Alex?
Yes, sir.
Pater? Okay.
Chancellor, President Malumed, members of the board, thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak. I just wanted to let you know that the Student Senate is in full support of the proposals regarding e-transcripts and common assessment. We believe that common assessment will allow students to more efficiently transverse the system, as well as creating cost savings that will also affect student success. And then e-transcripts is pretty much a no-brainer. I don't know anyone that uses snail mail anymore, let alone students that use snail mail. It will also allow students to be able to get their transcripts at a significantly faster rate, which means that their transcripts, when they transfer, will also be processed faster and therefore be able to get into their institutions of transfer at a faster rate. And just wanted to say thank you, and hopefully you will be able to support those proposals.
Thank you.
Thank you.